Hey everybody, this is Mr. George, and today I'm going to put together a video for you that looks at the post-classical period. This video isn't going to go over every single thing that happened because we're talking about 1,000 years, but I do want to look at the major areas of Europe and Islam, Africa, as well as China, and to kind of show these connections that are taking place um, during this time period from around 500 AD to 1450. So first, just to kind of give you an idea of like where we end up uh, within this map, we've got all these lines, different colored lines, are trade routes that are connecting different parts of Asia and Europe and the Arabian Peninsula, as well as not just northern Africa, but also the East African coast. So we have these Indian Ocean trade routes that are connecting China and India and Arabia in the east coast of Africa. We've got these trans-Sahara trade routes that are coming out of the Western African kingdoms, coming across the Sahara Desert, getting us to the cities along the Mediterranean, Tunisia, Cairo, as well as the Mediterranean trade routes that are now linking Europe with Africa, as well as Arabia. And then we see in red the Silk Roads that are connecting not just China with India and Persia, but also inevitably connecting Europe and China. And the last group that we see is the Arabian Peninsula, which really is the crossroads of these of three continents, which is where we see the beginning of Islam, and then we'll start to see Islam spread. All right, good. So let's get right to it, and let's look at some timelines. Now, this looks at Europe. We've already covered this in a prior video looking at the Middle Ages, but it does make a lot of sense to just kind of revisit what's going on in Europe during this time period. So, quick recap, we see the western half of the Roman Empire is declining and falls with no longer a central government. We see kingdoms appearing. During the Middle Ages, we see Christianity is increasing, it's becoming more popular, it is rising. In 732, we see Charles Martel at the Battle of Tours, where the Christians repel the Muslims back. Charles Martel becomes a savior of Europe. We see Charlemagne, who is crowned emperor around 800. We then will see Viking invasions, outside invasions between the Vikings, the Magyars, and the Muslims. So essentially, Europe is under siege. We see Otto in the beginning of the Holy Roman Empire around 900. So as we look at the different periods of time within Europe, we tend to look at four different labels. We have the Dark Ages, meaning dark as far as violence, loss of learning, death. We also see the Age of Faith, where we see, Christianity is a uniting factor in Europe. As we move to 1,000, we now start to see this commercial revolution, where we see business, we see movement of people, products, we see guilds, we see cities being revived, and this gets referred to as the Golden Age of Europe. During this time period, we're also seeing this age of feudalism, where feudalism becomes this political system where where land is provided to nobles from kings in exchange for loyalty, and then we see these feudal manners. Again, this was a large piece within the Middle Ages video that I've already done. And feudalism was a result of the outside invasions. We see the splitting of the church in 1054. We see the power of the church and the Pope when we see the Crusades in 1095, in which we see the Christians and the Muslims that are fighting for the Holy Land. We see the Magna Carta in 1215. We then see Marco Polo, who travels from Europe to China in 1275, and essentially ends up being the one who unites East and West. When we say China and Europe, as he returns to Europe with the tales of what it was like within the reign of Kublai Khan within the Yuan dynasty. And then we see gunpowder reaches Europe, and this is happening through the Silk Roads and through trade, as gunpowder originated in China. As a result of this trade, we see the bubonic plague around 1340, where Europe is decimated. What we're also seeing in 1375, and I'll show you this picture later, it's the Catalan Atlas that is a creation that shows the map of Europe and Africa and Arabia, that kind of ends up showing the Europeans what else is out there as far as people, as far as products, and really kind of sparks this age of discovery. As well as Marco Polo also kind of has this, sparks the willingness for people to travel, not just for gold and glory, but also to spread Christianity. And this kind of leads us into the Renaissance. Okay, after the plague, after Europe comes out of that, and then we start to see, Portugal is really a rising star as it really engages in North Africa through Henry the Navigator and their navigation, and really ends up being the leader in the European slave trade that ultimately they'll bring to Brazil, and then ultimately other nations once we get to the age of discovery during the early modern period. And in 1453 is significant for several reasons. The Muslims take down Constantinople, the end of the Byzantine Empire. We see the end of feudalism. We see the end of the 100 Years' War between between England and France, and it really kind of like marks the end of the Middle Ages, European Middle Ages. Now, as we look at Islam, we see that it originates in the Arabian Peninsula, just Arabs, and then we start to see the spread of Islam. As far as we see these dynasties. So originally it starts with Muhammad, and then we get the rightly guided caliphs. We get the Umayyads in 661, which is where we see Damascus as the center. And again, in 732, as Islam is spreading across northern Africa and crosses into Europe, this connects with the Battle of Tours. And then we see the Abbasids create this golden age of Islam, and this is the Abbasid dynasty. And this is where the capital is moved from Damascus to Baghdad, and this is where we get the House of Wisdom. And as far as the golden age of Islam, Islam is thriving. It does all the way up until we get to 1250. So we also, have the Crusades here, where they're fighting for the Holy Land, in which they keep Jerusalem at the conclusion of the Crusades, as the Crusader spirit dwindles. And we see on their eastern front, they are having conflict with the Mongols, who actually destroy Baghdad in 1250. This brings us to the rise of the Ottomans, or the Ottoman Turks, where in 1453 we see the Ottoman Turks conquer Constantinople. Because the Ottomans take Constantinople, this really becomes the driving force behind why the European nations end up trying to find a sea route to the Indies, okay? Because they lose control of the Mediterranean as a result of the Muslims in this land empire, the Ottoman Turks, and as a result, it really creates the sea travel that we see initially with Portugal, and then we'll see it with Spain, as well as the Netherlands and England and France. So as we move down the timeline in Africa, we see we have these African kingdoms that are developing, and we see Ghana, where we don't have much information on Ghana. We have much more on Mali. But as Islam is spreading, Islam is coming through North Africa, and we're seeing, caravan routes. We have two Berber groups in the north of Africa that really help establish these caravan routes. And really, what's important about Africa is that it becomes the important trading networks where we see, Timbuktu, and where we see salt, where we see specifically gold that really gets linked with African slaves. They really go hand in hand with the mining of gold and the need for African slaves. When we get to Mali, we see Sanjata, as well as the most famous individual, Mansa Musa, who makes a pilgrimage to Mecca as far as the Hajj, and we see the influence that Islam has on Africa. And then when we're talking about China, we see, after the fall of the Han Dynasty, we have the Sui Dynasty that was very short-lived, very intolerant, and we see the construction of the Grand Canal that really links the north and south of China, which really sees the explosion in population. The next two dynasties, the Tang and the Song dynasty, are each about 300 years each, and this is referred to as the Golden Age of China at this point. During this time period, we not just see some trade, but we see the invention of the mechanical clock, we see porcelain, we see demand for products coming out of China that are making its way through to other civilizations, specifically silk. Okay. So during this time period, we see gunpowder, we see all these advancements, poetry, literature, and then what's happening is with the rise of the Mongols, the storm from the east, they end up creating the Yuan dynasty with Genghis Khan creating the largest contiguous land empire in the history of the world. And the Pax Mongolica, which is referred to as the Mongol Peace, really shows that the Mongols were able to conquer via the trade routes of the Silk Road. And then through China, as a result of this trade, we're going to see the connection with the plague. So looking at those timelines that we were just looking at here, you're going to be able to see when we overlay them that really, the plague kind of comes through all of them, in specifically Northern Africa here. But you can start to see that they really are all interconnected, where the trade networks are essentially linking these different cultures. We're seeing conflicts. We're also seeing, the rise of Christianity and the rise of Islam, and eventually, we're going to see the European nations starting to explore with this age of exploration, as well as this resurgence of humanism in Europe through the Renaissance, which will lead to other areas, specifically the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. So I hope, actually, there's one more thing I need to show you. And this is the map that the Europeans created, that really created the demand for gold, and created like much greater awareness as to what was outside of their borders. And here we see Mansa Musa holding the gold nuggets here. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Hope it was a good summary of like the post-classical period, looking at several different civilizations. And thanks for watching.